How many of you are in a class, writing class, right now? I'm just kind of curious, a show of hands, okay? What are your writing interests, by the way?
I have none.
Okay, all right.
I'm being honest.
That's fine, I like that. How about yours? Same, okay.
Poetry, is that?
Poetry, that's important, writing. Poetry is incredibly important, because to be a poet, you have to be able to condense concepts down to shorter phrases and words. It is, I think, one of the most effective ways of communication. So if you're really working on poetry, congratulations, because I think that that's a very powerful, evocative way to communicate. And I think that's great. So you know something about it. Are you practicing? You write poetry?
I do it a little bit on my free time whenever I'm
Yeah.
busy, but it's not nothing that I'm just like
Right.
really doing right
Yeah. Or people who would say that they're into composing music. Another form of using imagery and themes to try and communicate with people. And sometimes in very powerful ways, because you think about universal themes that people can relate to. A lot of it has to do with personal things in our lives too. So, who else has got? I saw some other hands in the back there. How about you?
What was the question?
You, yeah.
What was the question?
What are you interested in writing about? Do you have certain writing interests?
Not particularly, no.
Okay, all right. Anybody else? Yes.
There's nothing specific that I'm interested in writing about, but I definitely want to polish those skills because I know that I'm always going to need them.
Okay. All right. So I'll give you my overall philosophy, and I use this generally with students because they're preparing themselves for careers, and I tell my students, and I'll tell all of you the same thing that I tell my students, is that no matter what you do in your life, to be effective with your objectives in life, you have to work on communication. You have to be able to explain to people the importance of things that matter to you. You have to work to try and understand with people through communication what's important to them, so that you can find out if you're working with each other or against each other, and if you're working against each other, maybe finding ways to work with each other, or at least to get along. So, but one of the questions I ask students is, how many of you have a job? How many of you? What do you do?
I work for the city leagues.
You work for the city league, like a rec league, and have a
Overnight audit at the hotel.
overnight audit at the hotel and
Coffee shop.
coffee shop. Okay. Who's your boss?
Like you want to read PJ?
Huh?
PJ?
PJ?
Yeah.
And who's your boss?
Cherie.
Who's your boss?
Yeah, he done it.
Okay. No, they're not your bosses. Who do you really work for when you work at the coffee shop?
Customer.
Customer. Your customer is also your audience. And those are the people who ultimately will determine whether I have a job as a teacher, my students are my audience, if you will. They're really my bosses. If I'm going to continue to be an educator, I have to, my students have to agree that I'm effective enough to continue being an educator. And if they feel that I'm not, because we do teaching evaluations, and this is what happens sometimes to professors, if they're not good teachers, they don't wind up pulling jobs. If they're on a tenure track, they won't be tenured. If they're a lecturer, they won't be renewed as a lecturer. So if you and the people you work with at your hotel, you answer to a boss, but that boss answers to somebody else, and ultimately, wherever you work, I work. If we're not taking care of our audience, our viewers, our readers, our students, whatever, then we won't have a job. So it's important that we learn how to be effective communicators and to be able to distinctly be able to, I want to find out, what can I do to do a better job here? What's working for you? Why is it not working? You and I may not always agree, but at least I'll try and explain to you the purpose of you being in this classroom, those kinds of things. So that's my overall philosophy about communication. And in our society, it's more important than ever because there are so many messages out there that we have to communicate against to be able to get our thoughts, our ideas across so that we can truly be unique and even desirable, hopefully, and trusted. And so we want to be credible, we want to be trusted, we want to be entertaining, we want to be informative, we want all those things, hopefully, to be working for us. If you're a comic, right, Louis C.K., he's an effective communicator, right? He touches you with humor, but he also does it in ways that we can all relate to, and in some perverse ways sometimes, but that's part of what satire is about anyway. And some people do it better than others. So other forms of communication. In journalism, effective communicators, I think, are the ones that can be relied upon because they get it right. And because they care about getting it right consistently, they can be trusted upon for giving the information that they need to give to the audiences that they serve, particularly when it matters. September the 11th is one of those times when it really mattered in this country to everybody. On that day, everyone who is alive in the United States, with a few notable exceptions, were focused on this terrible terrorist attack that had happened against this country. And they were all wondering what it meant for this country holistically and what it meant for them individually and for their families and what might follow. And what followed, of course, were our engagement in World War II and other Afghanistan, Iraq, and so forth and so on. So anyway, communication. So I digress. I want to talk about storytelling today because getting facts right, or being good storytellers, really kind of begins with each one of you and your ability to be able to tell stories. And you only do that. You only get to be a good poet or a good writer, whatever you do, by practice, practice, practice. Nobody is just born a natural writer. Some people have maybe more gifts than others, but you have to work at it. You have to hone that skill set, and that also includes communication. So how are you at storytelling? Because I always tell people it starts with good storytelling. All right? So how do you tell a story? How do you look at a set of facts and digest those facts and tell a good story in a way that you can engage your audience? All right? Anyone have any ideas about that? Yes?
Focus on a single detail that humanizes those facts. So if there is, some element of the person's wardrobe maybe that is like really unique, maybe that could be an opening into the story, something that captures your senses.
Curiosity, something that kind of draws us in, right?
Mm-hmm.
What makes for good storytelling? And how can you be a good storyteller? How can you engage people?
Like you said, knowing your audience.
And knowing your audience, yes. Yeah, you want to know your audience first, right? Because culturally, and demographically, there can be differences. So is it a general audience? When you work in the television news business, it's a general audience. So you have to try to figure out what's the most effective way to try and resonate with the most members of that general audience out there. All age groups, race, religion, whatever. You have to figure out what are the most effective tools to use to be able to communicate with that audience. But there can also be niches. I'm going to show you, this is another story I did. This is just the opening segment of it. Storytelling, a different type of storytelling. This is historical, but it also uses people who were part of that history who are still alive. And when I was in Ohio working as a reporter, this was a story that I was really interested in, and I wound up turning it into a 1-hour documentary. It's won several awards. This past year it won the Canada International Film Festival Award for documentary. But what I try and get to do when I tell stories is I'm looking for good stories to tell, and I'm looking for good characters to tell the stories with. So this was about the premise of the story is a small college in the foothills, the Appalachian foothills of southeast Ohio, dirt poor, country poor. And the college is on the verge of bankruptcy. There are less than 100 students left. And there was this fiery coach who came out of the cold country of southeast Ohio. His name was Newt Oliver. And Newt recruited this basketball team with the idea that we are going to put together a team of guys who come from dirt poor towns, and we're going to be so good that we're going to beat everybody, and we're going to go on the road, and we're going to get famous, and we'll be nationally recognized, and we will save this college from bankruptcy. And a year from now, we'll be playing in Madison Square Garden.
My word.
So this is the opening stanza to that. So this is the setup for the document.
Program.
And the idea is hopefully to get the audience's attention. So hopefully we'll see what you're listening with here.
Program provided by the College of Journalism and Mass Communications at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, with additional production support from WOSU
So this is just
Public Media
kind of the opening
and
wrapper
Blue
to give you a
Skies
sense
HD
of where the
Video and Film
documentary is.
Productions. The following is a Painted Rock production.
Maybe once in a lifetime, a story comes along.
Couldn't happen. I don't believe it, yet I know, because I lived it.
A story so vivid, yet imperfect enough to be the stuff that legends are made of.
We had 38 boys in a whole college. But we had 8 people who could play the game of basketball.
This is the story of the Rio Grande Redmen. They roared from the hill country of southeast Ohio, their college about to go broke. Yet this team did more than just stand college basketball on its ear.
We averaged more than 100 points a game. Vigo Francis was averaging more than 50 by himself.
The Redmen captured the hearts and imagination of an entire nation. A fiery coach named Newt, a tall, skinny country boy people called Bebo, and a team that refused to surrender.
This is a story that needs to live on for generations and generations to come.
The Redmen didn't just play to win, they played to save their school. They didn't know it then, but they may have also saved the game of college basketball. They could really play the game.
Basketball is a team sport. It's not an eye sport.
Anyway, did I tweak your curiosity a little bit?
Yes.
Okay, so the purpose again is to try and establish themes, and then the rest of the documentary hopefully delivers on those themes as we develop the characters and the storyline that follows. So again, what you're looking for is how can I tell stories in ways that will make people want to know more? And usually that begins with me. It begins with you. It's like, what is there about the story that you kind of go, wow, that's really neat. I can get excited about that. It's fun to tell a good story. And then the storytelling begins, and you begin to refine it, and you look for other themes to go along with it. But that was a tough story to tell because Newt Oliver Newt was the guy who goes, basketball is not a team. It's a what did he say? It's not a nice sport, you know. Just the way he said it, that gravelly voice. But he was a great
Funding
character.
and support for this program provided by the College of Journalism and Mass Communications at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, with additional production support from WOSU Public Media and Blue Skies HD.
Okay, so anyway, so storytelling. I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint here and just go through a couple of quick facts here with you, then we'll kind of take it from there. But
Who is Painted Rock?
that's my production
That's your
company.
production.
Yeah. When basically I'm a rights holder on this, so you know that's basically all I have.
Is that true of all the documentaries you do? Are you the guy who owns them?
I was on that project. I will be on the Purging project. It'll be a co-production with NET and with the university. To kind of go from there, but yes, that's the purpose behind it. The slideshow go here. One second. There we go. Okay. Sorry about this. We have a slow computer.
You wanted to play the show?
Yes, thank you. There you go, okay. So just some really quick tips on, number one, respect your audience. Too often I think that people think about audiences, and And as this gentleman wisely pointed out, you got to know your audience, right? You have to know who your audience is and what's the best way for us to talk. So respect your audience. Don't talk down to your audience. Talk up to your audience and talk with them. Have that conversation. And think about the kinds of needs that your audience has, either through their own curiosity or information that they would find relevant to the story that you're telling. All right? Because nothing angers readers, viewers more than to tease them with something but not really delivering on the kinds of things that they expect to have in a good story. You know, in our society today, probably more than ever, we have a lot of hyperbole. Things get hyped, and then how many times have you gone to watch something, you get there and you go, this is really, disappointed. And if you paid money to watch it, you're even more disappointed. So, respect your audience. And also, don't give away the best part of the story. Sometimes young writers particularly have a tendency to want to start with the most amazing part of the story first. And I think really good storytelling is to establish a story and then to reveal information that will surprise your audience or capture their heart, if you will. I think great storytelling involves two things. Logically, you appeal to them, you give them interesting information, but then you have to be able to capture something within that story itself that puts people into the story themselves. They can imagine what it would be like if they were in that setting. Or they've been in situations like that before and they can relate to the successes or the failures of the people, the characters involved in that story. So think about that character development. But when I produce a story, I call these gold coins. I want to have gold coins in this story so that as the audience goes through and you reveal something to them as they watch this story, listen to it. And the Pershing story, one of the reveals is obviously going to be the death of his wife and his 3 daughters in the fire in the Presidio. That's a revealing moment where I think when we took the break here, you and I were talking about that. You said at that moment, what happened when that moment hit you?
Yeah, all of a sudden then that made it real and I was engaged and I wanted to know, okay, he knows the stakes. All the rest of his life he's going to be informed by that to know what the stakes are when he makes a commitment.
You know, the poet Khalil Gibran said that our capacity as human beings to understand things in life is based on the suffering that we've had. And I've always kind of drawn by that. You have to know what pain and loss sometimes are like to understand just how fortunate we are sometimes in having the blessings we are given in our own lives. So don't give away the best part of the story. Be careful with it. You can give away general information as long as you promise the story's interesting specific facts and then lay them out. The goal of good writing is to draw your audience into a complex and deep story. And again, that kind of goes back to you. It's up to you to try and simplify the story so your audience understands it. But simplifying a story doesn't mean dumbing it down. It means understanding how you can make it understandable to your audience. And I've worked in a lot of newsrooms in the past 30 some odd years where I've seen producers go, well, we're not going to do that story because it's too complex. And to me, that's code language sometimes for, we're not going to do that story because I don't understand it, therefore I don't think my audience understands it. And I think that can sometimes be a shortcoming of any storyteller. If it's really important, then it's incumbent upon you, the storyteller, to come to an understanding with that so that you can explain it to your audience. So, okay. So, complex discussions. Remember, complex doesn't mean that you can't break it down. It means that you have to break it down, but you can't abandon it because sometimes some of the most compelling stories are very complex stories that the writers have been able to break down in ways that made it truly unique for their audience because the writers were able to achieve something that other writers who were less talented couldn't because they couldn't come to an understanding of the story. So allow yourself that notion. Sometimes I have to go back and time again, I go to Tim. Tim, what's the relevance of this when we're talking about John Pershing? How long do we talk? A couple of hours.
Yeah, you said it was gonna be a half hour, it was an hour and a half.
Right,
The
yeah.
guy ran out of battery on the camera.
Right.
He had to go find another battery.
Yeah, but you know, again, it's like, don't be afraid to really dig in and scratch beneath the surface. I call it getting muddy. If you're gonna get into a story, you gotta get in there and get muddy. You gotta get dirty. And part of that process for me is saying to myself, I don't know exactly where this story is gonna go, but I'm gonna start throwing some of that mud up on the wall to see what sticks. And that's where some of the themes begin to emerge, and you can put them together and see how they begin to flow. So those are some of the things I keep. I use the example of news teases here, because again, news teases, just like poetry, it brings into focus the concept with words. So I oftentimes will play this game with myself. Tell me that story in one sentence. In other words, what is that story? When you look at that story in one sentence, tell me what that story is about. Because it then forces you to really identify what we call the nut of the story. What is the one singular element about the story that makes it compelling? And then we can work from that, okay? So, again, these are television news tease. When Omaha's mayor's, imagine you're watching a tease for tonight's 10 o'clock newscast, and you hear the anchor say, when Omaha's mayor will raise taxes tonight at 10, okay, all right. But what does that really tell you? It doesn't really tell you that much about the story, so this is the conversation you and I had. Your audience really wants to know why. Why is he going to raise? So here, the tease, a better tease would be why Omaha's mayor will raise taxes. You know, we're going to tell you the why part, because that's what you're depending on us as experts, supposedly, to be able to find out and give you that information. I mean, if he's going to raise taxes or she's going to raise taxes, maybe there's nothing I can do about it. But if I know why they did it, then maybe I'll decide whether I vote for them in the next election or not. Okay, so those are the motivational things. Again, usually when you tell stories, you got to keep coming back and saying, okay, what's the why here? Because usually the answer to that question is the emotional connector to the story that takes the facts and gives you some sense of the context that explains why this happened. Here's the reason why. Here's what it means for you. Okay, so again, the more superficial you are, the less credibility you have in storytelling. The more substantive you are, the more credibility you have in storytelling. And this goes back to complexity again. So just quick issues to think about. Again, I'm using writing tips here. You know, raising a question: Did Lincoln police catch the killer? As a newscaster, if you hear that as a tease, if I'm your local anchor and I come on and I'm teasing the 10 o'clock newscast and I'll say, why did Lincoln police catch the killer? What are you thinking as an audience? Some people might be thinking like, Barney, isn't that your job to tell us? You know? So anyway, a stronger lead here. Again, this just goes back to writing again. The unlikely tip that led to a Lincoln man's arrest. I'm giving you some information, and then I'm going to deliver on that tonight at 10 o'clock. So, silly, interesting, specific details. No cheap tricks, please. The audience knows credibility. Okay, so I'm just going to shoot. This is a lot of journalism stuff. I'm just going to throw it out there because I think it relates to writing and general communication in general. Was there a question over there?
Yeah, and I'm sorry if this is a segue, and if it's not applicable, you don't have to answer it. But I understand you're talking about best practices in journalism. And I totally agree with you that the more superficial, the less credibility a story has. But it seems to me like our general audience is craving the superficial and turning away from the deeper stories. So is that something you can address really quickly?
Sure. So you think that the audience is going more for the superficial?
Well, it seems like that's what we offer people.
Okay.
You know, that we don't offer people a lot of...
I don't disagree that we too often are superficial. And I do a lot of this for news directors and for journalists when I put on workshops on the journalistic side. And I just asked them, I said, stop for a second and really think again about what are your audience's needs and desires for information, and what's really relevant to tell them. In this case, if you're trying to get them into your story, to get them to watch your newscast or whatever. It's like, I'm gonna give you information that explains to you right now why I think it's important for you to watch this story. And usually that's not gonna be a question I'm gonna ask my audience. Because you're inviting them not to watch if you ask me a question. It's like, why did the Lincoln police catch the killer? And the audience's answer is, because I don't care. And I won't watch you tonight at 11 o'clock or read your book or whatever you're producing. Okay? So actually research has shown is that audiences want to have specific information. You know, we all have less time in our busy worlds today, by and large, and so please do give me relevant information that I can choose to listen to, understand, and act upon.
So do you find that is holding true with what our media is providing?
Depends on where you're looking. You know, when you say media, I think there are some very good purveyors of it out there, and I think there are some others. Here's what I think the real issue is today. There are more purveyors of media information than ever before. And there's a lot of bad stuff out there, and there are still some very, very good reporting outlets out there. But because there's more bad in ratio to the good stuff, I think that the danger is that the good reporters, the responsible journalists get lumped in with the bad. And that's unfortunate. Yeah. And again, you know, it's not like, when you say the media, it's not one entity. It's all those things mixed together. And I think it's unfortunate. But I also think that that's an opportunity for those media outlets. And there are great success case histories in there, media outlets who consistently get it right. And I work for one in Columbus. There are many others across the country. And usually they're the ones who enjoy long-term rating success and revenues because they care about getting it right, and they really do. They're good storytellers, really good storytellers. So, again, so, you know, think about how you develop your stories and kind of go from that point there. What else do I have here? Depends on the story, things to keep in mind. What's the story about? Saying things meaningful. Keep it simple, focus on people. Again, think about, you were talking about sources, weren't you? You know what kind of sources there are in a story?
What kind of sources?
Yeah, what sources are there? Yeah, there are 4 types of sources in the story. And what are they? What'd you do today? What's the most relevant thing that you've done today?
I went to church.
You went to church. Okay, so if I'm doing a story about why many Americans still go to church on a regular basis, and I do an interview with you, then you would be an informal source in that story. An informal source is a source that's not the expert necessarily on religion per se, although you might be, but your expertise is through the experience that you have personally by attending church and the relevance that you get by going to church. So that's the human condition, okay? So that's an informal source in a story, all right? The other sources, journalistic sources, if I'm doing an interview with a newspaper writer who writes about religion and covers that beat, then can maybe explain why more or fewer people, why more or fewer millennials are going to church or believe in religion today, that's a journalistic source. Source number 2. Source number 3, institutional sources, okay? The institutional source could be the pastor, priest, whoever at your church talks about what brings people in. But they're the person who have the expertise within. And the last one is a scholarly source. It would be someone who is a scholar who actually, in a very impartial way, because they're a scholar, study and do research on religion and motivations for people that, in your case again, will explain why more or fewer Americans are attending church on a regular basis today. So scholarly, journalistic, informal, and what was the last one?
Institutional.
Institutional, okay. Now, and I always tell this to my students, every time you tell a story, depending on the story, you want to think about those sources, because the most relevant one to most audiences is the informal source. It's the one that, walk a mile in my shoes, right? I can understand this because I've been there, right? So that's a really powerful force in every good story, okay? When you write poetry, what do you write poetry about?
Life.
Okay, life, but what kind of life? Your life? Okay, so that you're explaining the way that you look at your own life, your own experiences through your poetry.
Or how I perceive like the world.
Okay, so you're using yourself as a powerful informal source to be able to express yourself in your storytelling. Okay, but the other sources that you can use around that all create different layers of confirmation and accountability. And so when I tell students to go out and report on a story, I say, give you an example. One of my students last semester said, I want to do a story on human trafficking here in Nebraska. All right? What was the easiest source for this person to, actually he'll be competing in the Hearst National Championships next month in San Francisco, one of the top 5 stories in the country this year. Okay? So when I'm having this conversation with Evan, and I said, okay, what sources do you have? What do you think the easiest source of those 4 sources was for him to get? No. Sex trafficking. That was the hardest source for him to get.
Oh, the name of the type of source.
Yeah. And that was the whole point. It's like, he could get lots of experts to talk about sex trafficking here in the state of Nebraska, law enforcement, and lawmakers who are trying to pass legislation to do a better job of cracking down on sex trafficking here in the state. I mean, relevant issues, okay? But this is a very deeply personal story. And when we're talking about an issue like sex trafficking, what is going to be the transcendent element in the story that's going to make it relate to the audience? You have to go out, if you want to do this story, and it's a great story, but how often do you find stories about sex trafficking that have an informal source in it? And oftentimes, it's really difficult to find people who are willing to talk about their own personal experiences. In his case, it was a woman who was induced to go to China and travel, and she gets over there and has to turn her passport in, and they're using her for sex trafficking. And eventually she was able to extract herself, but she was willing to talk openly about her experience. And it gave that whole, suddenly everyone's plugged into the story. And it makes it powerful and relevant. So yeah. Those are the kinds of things like, I really, again, you're looking for that human connection. But think again about, sometimes, again, it's, my daughter just did a story, and it's great. Because she was the informal source that she was talking about before she gave birth to our grandson last November. She said, everyone was telling me about postpartum depression, right? And she goes, but nobody talks about depression while you're pregnant. Oh, congratulations, you're having a child. That's great. And my daughter's going, then why am I depressed? And she starts talking with other friends of hers who have had children and other older women. And many of them say, there were times when I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what was going on with my life. I felt like I had lost all sense of myself. So she wrote firsthand about this. And then I talked, Emily is her name, and she wrote the article that's been published. But I said, now's a great time to go back to a good institutional source, a psychiatrist or psychologist who can talk about, again, it's not just postpartum depression. It can be depression, while you're pregnant. It can be depression at any time for anybody. But specifically, in this case, women who are pregnant and are having to put up with depression. Again, with this idea in society that you're supposed to be just having a great time and you're happy and it's a joyous occasion, and all those things are true. But depression, as we know, can be clinical, right? So she found this great psychologist to talk to, and so you had all these things working really well in tandem with each other. You had the expertise that goes with, it's not just my daughter Emily who felt this way, it's many women like her and others who deal with this. And it's not really widely discussed that I know of, is it? I thought it was a unique topic, and so did her publishers at Disney. Can't remember the name of the online one that she wrote for, but anyway, looking for unique angles. And sometimes it's like, you start talking with people and they're all talking about the same thing, and then you say, well, how come no one's ever explored this before? And so she found something there. So I'm saying is look for those things that captivate your own sense of curiosity. and interest, and then kind of go from that point on. And when you're looking for story characters, when I say characters in a story, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when I say a character in a story? I mean, what are you envisioning when I say that?
Well, I think of the protagonist and then immediately the antagonist.
Okay.
So what's the conflict?
So you can have those yeah. As a storyteller in news sometimes, conflict is always one of those things. We talk about what makes a story important. Elements that make stories important. It can be locality. The closer that something is that happens to you, the more relevant it is. So locality, timeliness, controversy, which is something you just talked about. You have an antagonist and protagonist, right? Those kinds of things. So again, giving some sense of what's the overall impact of that story? How do people relate to it? Another part of relevance to storytelling is the character well known or not well known? If Barney McCoy drives home tonight from this lecture and I get pulled over for driving under the influence, not too many people care. But if it's a football coach at the University of Nebraska, then a lot of people will be talking about that tomorrow, probably. Okay, so things to think about as you go forward. Anything else I can add to that equation?
Could you repeat those four sources again?
Yes. Informal. Informal sources, again, are, I think they're the most important ones because they're the ones that reflect the way that all of us might relate to the story itself.
It's the most human element.
The human element. And the human element is really the element of the heart. It brings the heart into the equation. It's not just giving you the dry facts and statistics, but it's the one that puts the face on that story. It's the one that makes it living and breathing flesh and blood. And then the other source is a institutional. I'd probably rate them this way. Is number one importance overall is developing a story with informal sources. Because that's the one of experience, personal experience. Institutional tend to be the ones that relate to that story by virtue of the duties that they have that are connected with it. So if I'm interviewing a firefighter who went into this building and rescued this family and got them out alive, okay, I got that part of the story. That's going to be, and that person is going to be a really powerful institutional source that's describing, we got to the house, it was already on fire, we could hear people inside, we kick in the doors, we rescue them and they're okay. And then the informal source is going to be, that mother who got out alive with her children. And I was asleep at the time, I woke up and the room was filled with smoke and I was gasping and I didn't know where the children were. And I could hear flames, and I could touch my hand to the door, and I could feel the heat on the other side. I was afraid to open it, so all those things. So now you've got institutional, you have your informal source, and then it may not be relevant. Journalistic sources sometimes, in other words, people who cover stories like this and have their own expertise by covering a story over and over again. It could be someone, for example, who's a political pundit, who's talking about covering the Republican race or the Democratic race in this presidential election. And then a scholarly source, again, could be somebody who has scholarly expertise because this is a specific area of research expertise that they have. And scholars, by virtue of the fact that if you're going to be published, anything that you publish typically is going to be peer-reviewed. It's going to be reviewed by other scholars who have your same expertise, and usually before it gets published, those other peer reviewers have to agree that this is worthy of being published. So you're supposed to be more neutral and less opinionated. So those are the different sources. Would you ever use all four? Not too often. I'd say the primary sources you use oftentimes in this documentary is going to be, Tim McNeese is going to be one of my institutional sources. He's a historian. He's written a book about Pershing. He has a firm understanding and grasp of American history. So he's a great institutional source. But he's also a scholar, too, okay? Probably more on the scholarly side. That would be more of your expertise.
Oh, whatever you think.
Yeah. Maybe more of the institution would be somebody that I would maybe do an interview with from the U.S. military to give us their perspective. And you would be more scholarly, yeah. Journalistic, not necessarily, unless it had been someone who who was still alive, who had covered. And actually, what I'm doing, I go back and use original documents, and so I'm getting actually articles that the journalists have written about World War I and some of that stuff. So you're using those documents in the storytelling as well. So they all bring different things. I'll show you one more thing, and then we'll call it a day. I can do an exercise. There's a couple things I have. I'll give you guys an option here. I think I mentioned when I started this afternoon, I was 24 years old, and I covered the Hyatt Regency Skywalk collapse in Kansas City. And 30 years later, they invited me to come back and revisit that story. We put together a 1-hour special for the CBS affiliate in Kansas City, and it was cathartic to me because I had a chance to go back and get answers to questions that were not available when I covered that story in 1981. And one of the most interesting people that I did an interview was the doctor, who was the triage doctor that night, who had to make the life and death decisions about who he thought would survive, and they should try and rescue first, and who they would have to give pain medication to, but they're probably not going to make it. They're probably not going to be alive an hour from now. Or do we amputate or not? Those kinds of questions. I can show you that. Or we can do an exercise where I can just give you some facts, and I can have you guys look at the facts, and then each of you tell me what you think are the most important elements if you were going to tell that story. So I show you the story. Huh? They need to do that. Okay. All right. Yes?
Where does the anecdotal fall in all of this? Is it more about sometimes that's what's piquing your interest, is to follow through and write a story that's either going to see if there's any truth to it, or I'm just curious because
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that
it's a lot
question.
of what people think or say, which may or may not be true, but it also surrounds.
Yeah. I guess if I was going to explore an anecdotal topic, then it would be in trying to separate fact from fiction. When I tell stories, I don't use anecdotes. I prefer to engage my audience with what I found to either prove or disprove the story.
But sometimes the anecdote nonetheless has a powerful sway with the audience.
And I'd have to ask you for examples, because I can work off better examples. Do you have one in mind?
Or I'm thinking of one, well, just one, for example, is reading about one of these people I discovered when I came back out here to Nebraska, a guy named Ernie Bagnall.
Uh-huh.
You heard about him?
I don't know if I have. Go ahead.
Nebraska Educational TV did a story on him, and he was a guy that basically, he would have been a combination of a found artist, but he also believed that these creations that he made, that they were healing. They would heal people. And it's a fascinating story to follow what he's about. And the anecdote in there would be about his whole situation with his relationship to healing and how he came to see that his creations were generating healing energy and how people responded to that. So somebody heard about him and at some point decided it was worth telling his story.
But was he around to tell his story?
He was, I don't know if he was still alive, but no, he had died by then.
Okay, so we didn't have him or others to, okay. So then it was really a treatment of the topic about, did the topic wind up did the exploration of the topic wind up with, take it for what it's worth, this is what we found out. Was
They
that?
just told the straightforward story about what they could find out about him.
I mean, I think sometimes there are some incredible stories. There was a guy a couple of years ago. Well, he died several years ago. He was eccentric. He lived out in western Nebraska. He made all these wire sculptures. Same guy who believed that he was tapping into the forces. I mean, it was fascinating stuff, and it was on public television. And that treatment, though, the treatment of it was, to me, it was just incredible artistry. No matter what this guy believed, and no matter whether you believed what this guy believed, which I didn't, by the way.
Did or didn't?
Did not.
Right.
But I thought he was a genius in being able to express what he believed, and what he was building with, you know, his workshop and then all the little spin-off pieces of artwork that came into that. To me, that was the fascinating part about that story. And in that regard, yeah, it was, you know, to me, I never thought about that as being anecdotal. I thought about that being, you know, there's this is this person who lived. People had their own stories to tell about this.
Right, the story itself that was ultimately generated was not anecdotal.
Yeah.
But there were, so to speak, the energy surrounding him and of those who knew and lived in his community, that's the anecdotal part to me at some point that then becomes of interest to whoever goes and does the
Right,
story.
but what, to me, what made that story fascinating was when you look at the objects that he created. And you know, to me, there's a fine line between being crazy and eccentric. My definition of eccentric is if you have money, you're eccentric. Okay, if you're poor, you're crazy. Okay, so I guess he was a little crazy, but his genius was the detail that he put into these things that he believed would help him tap into another form of energy, a life form of energy. So I guess
We were watching a show this morning, and we left the hotel, and the character said, one of the characters claimed that God had spoken to him. And the lawyer says, when you speak to God, that's called piety. When God speaks to you, that's called crazy.
Yeah, could be true. I mean, you know, and the thing that I love about storytelling is everyone has the ability to interpret it, no matter who the storyteller is, for any way that they want to interpret it. So, all right, let me really quickly go through this because I know some of you probably have better places to be. And I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you again for the invitation. Okay, this is a true story. Hotel fire in Topeka overnight. So look at the details here. And then tell me or write down the lead to the story. In other words, the lead to the story is typically going to be that first 2 or 3 sentences of that story. And what I'm asking you to do is think about some of the relevant details that we've discussed here in the last hour or so. And how, in other words, where do you put emphasis on details in this story? This is just a quick one that we would do. But the purpose that I use an exercise like this for is, can you find the most relevant information and now present that to your audience in ways that will capture their attention and make them want to know more. And here, we're not necessarily looking for a deeper reveal. We want relevant information to make your audience go, hey, come here, look at this. Okay? So spend a couple of minutes looking at that and write a lead, if you will, to this story as if you were going to be presenting it tonight on the 6 o'clock news. And since if you want to do this in poetry,
Oh, sorry.
I'll take it. Okay. You do slam poetry?
That's what I'm trying to learn how to do. It's really
Okay.
hard though.
Yeah.
You gotta really watch a lot of it to kind of.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's hard though.
Well, good for you. I'm glad you're doing that. I'll give you about 3 or 4 minutes to try and sort this out. there are many different ways to effectively tell a lead to the story. And there are lots of bad ways to also handle the information too. So, or I would say less effective ways. So this is where I'm asking you to keep your audience in mind. Think about the relevant information that they would want to know. And then how would you explain that to them? The other thing that I teach, one of the classes I teach at the University of Nebraska is the broadcast news writing class, where students are actually producing live newscasts once a week. During their newscast shift, every half hour they have to produce a 2-minute live newscast on KRNU radio. And one of the things that this really helps students to develop is how do you take information and rewrite it so that you are effectively giving the same information, but you're putting a different emphasis on information, so the leads are different, slightly different, but they still are relevant to your audience. So that's why I'm saying, so normally what I tell students, when we do this exercise in the classroom, I'll say, take this information, now give me 4 leads, so that you're going to have a different lead for each one of your newscasts, and then tell me how you justify it, which is the critical thought part. Explain it to me. Explain it to me. Tell me why you wrote it that way. And sometimes they'll tell me something I never thought of too. The thing I do love about teaching is I always learn something from my students, and that's exciting to me. So that's what really makes it fun. Everyone ready? Give it a shot? All right. Who wants to start? Can we start with you?
You may. Maybe
Okay.
I'll be the cautionary tale. I said Saturday night shootout with feds leaves heavy fire damage at Topeka Country Club Motel.
Okay. All right. Anyone any thoughts here? Okay, we'll just go around really quickly. How about you?
That's kind of long. A hotel room caught on fire during a shootout Saturday night. Find out what was found inside tonight at 10 o'clock.
Okay. All right. All right. How about you?
Shootout between gunmen and federal agents at a Topeka, Kansas club leaves 3 wounded and 1 burned.
And 1
Burned.
Okay. All right. How about this table over here?
A shootout that left 3 U.S. Marshals wounded resulted in a fire at the Country Club Motel in Topeka, Kansas.
Okay. All right. Ms. Davis.
A fire at a Topeka motel was caused after a shootout between a gunman and federal agents at 10 o'clock Saturday. Details at 6.
Okay. Over here.
I just used one of your sentences and reworded a little bit. An unidentified body was found in the Country Club Motel, which caught fire during a shootout with federal agents.
No, you do not.
What? What?
Exact things.
All right. Okay, so let's talk about this for a second, and then I'll actually show you in fact, I'll hand this out while we're talking about it. This is Capital Journal article that actually appeared today. It's a bigger write-through, but okay. So one thing that just about everybody talked about was a shootout, right? So a shootout and then a fire. I think everyone talked about that. Not everyone talked about there being a body. Okay, all right. And let me see here. Hopefully, there'll be one more.
That's it.
All right. So, all right. So here are my druthers, and again, and I want people to explain to me why did you, what's your emphasis, where did you come from? So, to me, at this point, the most relevant part of the story is an unidentified body in that room where the fire broke out, okay? What's unclear to me in all of this is that they go to this hotel looking for a suspect whose name they know and age they know, but they haven't confirmed if that is the person whose body has been found inside this hotel room. We know that they came to serve a warrant. There were several federal agents. Gunshots broke out. At some point, the gunfire coming from this hotel room, fire breaks out, spreads to the rest of the hotel. The hotel is still smoldering this morning. The fire, all the episode broke out around 10 o'clock last night, right? Details. To me, the mystery right now, and this is why I would go with this, is the mystery here. We know how many agents were wounded? 3? 3 agents? And we know that they're minor, I mean, they're not life-threatening, right? We know that. What we do know is that there's a dead body. What we don't know, and this is what I think is fascinating, is who is that dead body? I want to know, so I would probably make that the emphasis of my lead. Something along the lines of this morning, law enforcement officials have a mystery on their hands. It's a dead body in a hotel room after a huge firefight with law enforcement officers that sent 3 of them to the hospital. Okay, something along those lines. And then you can kind of break it down from that point on. But to me, that's the most, in other words, and I'll tell you why. Why do we need to know? Because if that body is not the suspect, then what? But he's still out there. He's still at large. We know that this suspect used a shotgun, carjacking, robbery, attempted robbery. Okay? This information we know. He could, if this is not that body in the hotel, who is it? Is it the manager of the hotel? Is it someone else that he took hostage? And was he even in the hotel to begin with? But we do know, or until we know who the identity of this body is, this person could still be at large. It could still be a threat to society, and I sure as heck want to know. Because that's my audience, right? Does that make sense? So that, to me, that's the compelling thing, and that's probably what I would really build that around, is what are you asking people to do until you identify, until you know that this is the person that you think it is. What are you advising people to do? Those are the kinds of relevant details. And you'll notice, where did the reporter for the Capital Journal put that information about the body? I buried it. I mean, he should be in his lead someplace. But, I mean, to me, this is an example where you have a reporter who's giving lots of facts. And this is what I tell my students. I said, do you want to be a wood chopper, or do you want to be a carpenter? Because wood choppers chop wood and they just stack it up. Okay? A carpenter will take that wood and make a beautiful home with it that we can live in. Okay? That's the analogy that I use. And he's given us a lot of really relevant details. I think it's interesting. But to me, one failing of that story is that, oh, by the way, there's a body in that room. It's kind of like, okay, I find that rather interesting. So again, to me, this is how do you sort the facts out when you tell that story? And how do you capture your audience and give them that relevant information, particularly, again, if there's a potential threat that this is not the guy. Was that-
They do it quickly.
Right.
They gotta do it, yeah.
Yeah.
They're on camera right at
Right.
the scene.
Yeah, and it should instruct them themselves. Anyway, that's my, make sense?
It's the only unique part of the story.
From-
Otherwise, it's just
from-
one
yeah.
more shootout between some guys.
Well, you know, there's lots of questions. First of all, is okay. Here's a guy. I mean, normally you're going to send a sheriff in. There's no mention of any sheriff's deputies other than after the fact. Here we have U.S. Marshal Task Force and FBI. I'm not sure where the FBI comes in because they're usually only involved in cases like that. When they
It's got to be serious.
Well, it's something that's interstate too, and not interstate. So, it's a law enforcement detail. So, final thing I want to show you. This was that piece that I did. I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but I want to me, part of also when you tell stories and you develop characters, you know, character doesn't have to jump out of the box to be a character. Sometimes people who are quiet can be as powerfully emotional as anybody else. And Joe Wackerly was the doctor who I interviewed, who was doing triage that night at the Hyatt Regency. And it was fascinating to me, and I'll set it up for you because I sat down with Joe and I said, tell me what you were doing that night and how are you going through there and deciding who would go to the hospital and who couldn't, who would die. And he was giving me the clinical, really dry explanation. Well, we did this and we tried to do that. And, it was like very, and I let him finish saying that, and then I said this to him. I said, that must have really been difficult. And you could see the tears well up. I mean, that's that moment where again, that's where I thought I could. And as an interviewer, Barney, shut up and let silence take it. Just let silence do what it's going to do. Sometimes when there's silence, people want to jump back in and try and get back in the conversation. This is where you have to let it breathe. So I'll at least show you the part that I had leading up to him, and then we'll call it a day.
Were trapped in the debris that littered the Hyatt lobby. As far as people surviving, the people that are in there right now, it appears to be a very, very grim situation. The chances are very slim.
And you looked around and you went, oh my golly, what am I doing here?
Outside the Hyatt, Dr. Joe Wackerly and other first responders worked frantically to prioritize hundreds of injured, transport, and treatment at area hospitals. Inside the Hyatt, Wackerly and rescue workers faced another enormous challenge, making their way past those who died to reach those seriously injured and still pinned in the skywalk rubble.
And then unfortunately, we had the people that were going to die unless there was an immediate intervention.
It's a memory that still haunts Dr. Wackerly.
Did I make the right decisions in every instance? Did I do all the right things for every person that trusted me with their life? Could I have done a better job? Could somebody else have done a better job? If you're a professional and you care, you always should be asking those questions, but there's a point at which you need to let it go. And that's hard, especially given that night and those particular people and the way they died.
It'll be a long time before I forget what I witnessed in the last few hours.
Former Kansas City Fire Department spokesman Harold Kanabe was also there that night, and removing tons of debris to reach trapped victims was something Kansas City's firefighters had never faced before.
I did watch firefighters take machines working in tandem to lift literally hundreds of tons.
The handles on the hydraulic jaws that rescuers used got so hot that firefighters had to wrap them with rags to keep their hands from burning.
But they pulled those walkways apart while other firefighters crawled in to pull live victims and bodies out.
Kanabe remembers one reporter asked which firefighter was the biggest hero.
I was quite angry And I told him, those guys inside, just because they're wearing uniforms and special clothing, helmets, and all this kind of stuff, I said, go in there and look and see how many of them are crying like babies. I said, there's no heroes in there. There's guys just trying to save lives, and it's tearing their hearts out what they're seeing.
The important thing was to get the...
So, again, you know, connecting that story with the tragedy 30 years later, and it was interesting because I went back and interviewed a lot of the key principals, and you know, the ability to reflect back 30 years later really made it powerful, including someone who was actually there that night with his boyfriend, and when the skywalk came down, his boyfriend was dead, and he was standing next to him a foot away, and he survived. And he was, you know, dealing with that guilt 30 years later. Thank you again. Just I'm sorry for rambling, but hopefully you found something instructive in our conversation this afternoon. And I again really enjoyed the opportunity to come down and meet you all and have a chance to talk about storytelling with you. So take care.